Less and less makes any sense to me. People are struggling all around this country and all around the world. In many cases, it's nothing less than a life and death struggle. Talk about to be or not to be. For too many, that truly is the question. And those in positions of power, hypothetically in a position to help, are, on the contrary, making matters worse. Let me start with a story. I won't identify the person in question because, unlike the technocrats and those others committed to doing away with the concept of personal privacy, I believe a person's financial transactions are their own business and no one else's. But last week, someone close to me, and whose word I trust 100%, went into the bank to withdraw a few £1,000s in cash. The teller started asking questions, specifically about what the money was for. The person close to me said that it was for a private family matter. The teller made plain that that was not a good enough answer. That person close to me then said it was for a purchase. The teller asked, and I'm not making this up, "Is that the truth?" When told it was the truth, the teller then said, "If we find out you're lying, we can block your account." Let me make clear that I am relating the experience of a law-abiding, tax-paying citizen who entered a high street bank branch with passport and other ID in hand, seeking to withdraw some hard-earned savings, only to be treated like a criminal. Let's remember that official policy now is zero trust, which is to say the institutions, banks included, have decided we the people are best treated as guilty of crime or crimes unknown until we prove to the satisfaction of those unaccountable institutions that we are innocent. I don't know how you react to that story, and if required, I will happily swear on a stack of Bibles that it's the unalloyed truth, but it shocks me to the core. Remember when the idea of putting your money in a bank account was, first and foremost, about wanting the cash to be somewhere safe instead of in a shoebox under the bed? Remember when we maintained a simple trust in our high street banks? How young we were, how naive. Here and elsewhere, banks are teetering on the brink of ruin again, just like they did in 2008. The calamitous practices that made them teeter then, practices that would, if you or I had attempted anything similar, have put us in jail so fast our feet would never have touched the ground, were not even addressed, far less punished and stopped. Rather, their foundations, built on sand, were just shored up with more sand. Governments kicked the can down the road and no wrongdoer was ever held to account. Millions of Americans lost their homes that year, the same year that saw bankers get their bonuses as usual. Now the overburden of bad debt made of money created out of nowhere and lent over and over again, now all that debt that caused the trouble back then has been allowed to grow even bigger. Many are speculating that a final and catastrophic crash is coming for the banks, and maybe it is. But I ask you this, given that banks are private businesses run by unelected private business people and that they are empowered to create money out of nothing, how and why would they ever run out of that money? Unless it suited a grand narrative to have that happen. This steady disappearance of much that makes simple common sense to me is not limited to the activities of the wibbly-wobbly banks. It's about much more besides, simple and obvious stuff. In my family, we can clearly see that food prices have gone up by a half at least, and in some cases more. Certainly not by the few percentage points officially attributed to inflation. Sometimes the cost of our weekly shop has doubled, and that's a fact. When we moved into our house around 6 years ago, the standing order for our energy bill was about £200 a month. Right now it's nudging £800 a month. Our council tax has gone up by £1,000 per year. And yet we got another letter saying we would have to pay separately to have our garden rubbish collected. We've also to pay separately to park our car on the road outside our house. The latest budget did nothing meaningfully to address any of it, not for us, not for anyone else. Why, just as a for instance, does no government ever act to help those women who want to look after their own children at home full-time? Why is the emphasis always on providing childcare made as cheap as possible for those who need or want to take work outside the home? You might say, in many cases, that the system is deliberately structured so that as many people as possible are left with no option but to seek work outside the home if a roof is to be kept over the family's head. Such measures driving everyone into the marketplace to raise more tax revenue for the government are always predicated upon something else that makes no sense to me, which is to say the work of caring for children is always made among the lowest paid of all work. Why do governments always and only go out of their way to make it financially preferable to put children, the most precious element of our lives, in the care of those paid the least to do so? Why is the most important job of all, that of caring for the next generation in their youngest years, worth less than every other occupation? We have plummeting birth rates here in Britain and around much of the West. Governments routinely declare that the solution, the only solution indeed, is more immigration. But why not make it financially advantageous for couples to have children and to look after them themselves by ensuring one wage coming into the home is enough? Why are there no new tax breaks for families where one parent works and the other, in the vast majority of cases, let's be honest, the woman stays at home to look after the children? Too few babies are being born here and in Western countries all over the world. And how do governments respond? By making the role of full-time mother the most deliberately challenged and unattainable role of all. Where's the sense? Why does our society pointedly look down on those women, and again, let's be honest, it is mostly women, who want to dedicate their lives every day to caring for their own children? In what rational universe is that progressive? In what rational universe does that make sense? I say there's no sense anywhere. Rising energy costs are blamed on Russia. This is palpable nonsense. Energy companies selling oil and gas are making bigger profits than ever. There's also no shortage of oil and gas. Look to the Middle East, where oil trades at around $5 a barrel, costs $5 a barrel to get out of the ground. That's $5 for between 40 and 50 gallons. Those oil-rich states and the companies that get the oil out of the ground are simply making a killing, more and more, all the time. The so-called green revolution is powered by that same oil and gas, and will be into a point in the future so distant it's hardly worth looking for. The war we should all be paying closer attention to is not just the one in Ukraine, but that being waged all around us right now by greedy governments and their best friends, the transnational corporations, against their own people to keep those people down. The powers that be have let it be known there may be food shortages ahead. This is at the same time as those same powers that be are going out of their way to make it harder for farmers to produce food. Why are governments in the West harassing their farmers into giving up their land and culling their herds instead of encouraging them to produce more food and not less? This behaviour makes no sense to me. Billionaires like Bill Gates and John Kerry fly around the world in private jets. We all know that pound for pound, private jets generate the most emissions. If it really was about cutting emissions, those billionaires would take the simple step of stopping using private jets. But no, their response, the solution they prefer, is to make even more of those polluting flights so that they can preach against the use by us, the common folk, of the much more efficient passenger planes. This makes no sense to me. By far the best way to help poor people is to enable them to lift themselves out of poverty so they can take care of themselves and raise healthy, educated, well-adjusted children. Instead, in the past 3 years, we've seen the greatest transfer of wealth from poor to rich in all of history. More recently, even those who had only recently elevated themselves out of generations of poverty and into the emergent middle classes are being actively impoverished once more by the dedicated and deliberate actions of governments. Homes are being made harder to hold on to and harder to heat. Food and energy are deliberately being made ruinously expensive. In what rational universe does any of that make sense? Unless, of course, the presence of independent, healthy, educated, confident people is anathema to governments. Nowadays, I think of our government not as of the people, by the people, for the people, but rather as an enemy government in occupation. I say all that we are seeing, after 3 years like no others, 3 years of harms deliberately inflicted, are blatant attempts by governments and their little wizards to cover up and otherwise distract from the consequences of their own actions. Rather than by war in Ukraine, I say the ever-worsening hardship and relentless suffering of millions is caused by ideologically driven wickedness. The looming threat of God knows what next, whatever they try to frighten us with next, nuclear war, war with China, international terrorism. Noticeably, we haven't had any international terrorism for quite a while. Will surely keep many on edge and ready to comply with whatever life and freedom diminishing nonsense is proposed. What does make sense to me is history. In June 1816, the French ship Medusa set sail for Senegal with 400 passengers and crew. The captain was an upper-class incompetent, granted his position on account of who he was rather than his ability. On the 2nd of July, the Medusa ran aground off the West African coast. There was room in the lifeboats for just 250. The rest, at least 146 men and one woman, were put aboard a hastily assembled raft. The initial plan and promise was for the boats to tow the raft to safety, but after just a few miles, the ropes were cut. The poorest were literally cut adrift in the open sea with almost nothing. Tragically, but understandably, in those most dreadful of circumstances, the situation descended in the end into savage fighting and cannibalism. By the time they were rescued, purely by chance, only 13 men were left alive. The scandal was memorialised in the painting The Raft of the Medusa by the French artist Theodore Géricault, a more blatant and shaming demonstration of the abandonment of the poor by the powerful committed only to their own survival, even if it must mean the dehumanising debasement and sacrifice of those less fortunate. It's hard to imagine. It's all there to be seen on one vast 23 feet by 16 feet canvas. History has a great deal to teach us if we will only pay attention to it. It boils down to this: it's all happened before, and it will keep happening until we say no. All of that's my opinion, of course, and you're free to disagree. Keep your tweets and emails coming throughout the show, and you can email me at gbviews@gbnews.uk. You can tweet me as well at gbnews. I'll try to get to your comments later in the show if there's time.